Hello everyone! I hope you all had wonderful holidays and of course, Happy New Year's! So, what better to start this new year than learning how to survive board wipes? Yes, in 2023, you will be a board wipe survivor. No longer will those stupid board wipes ruin your game nights. And just heads up, in this video, I will not be going over specific cards to deal with board wipes. Don't worry though, I will be making a separate video for that. In this video, however, I will share with you the strategies and the mindset that you need to learn to improve your chances to survive board wipes. And trust me, oftentimes knowing this can be a lot more powerful than having specific cards. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Tip number 1, do not overcommit. So, you've probably heard this one a lot already. Committing too many of your resources, both cards and mana, could make you a target for removals and board wipes. And not only that, even if you're not a threat, you risk losing those resources from simple collateral damage, usually in the form of a board wipe. Yes, the board wipe might not have been intended for you, but nevertheless, gone goes your board. But how exactly do you not overcommit? Well, this is something you will learn through experience and understanding your deck and accessing the board and so on. There are a few more concrete pointers to get you started. So the first way to not overcommit is to simply hold back playing cards you don't really need at the moment. The simplest example of this case is that you often don't need 2 cards that do the same thing, even if it means you're getting more value out of it. Say you have a welcoming vampire and you can steadily draw cards from it already. In this case, you might just not want to play that Mentor of the Meek in your hand, even if you can. Because if a board wipe does happen, all of a sudden, you no longer have a steady card draw source at all. Next, you do want to consider holding back your cards if you're already ahead. In general, if you have the strongest board presence already, there's usually no need to double down on it and risk falling behind after a board wipe happens. Now, one obvious scenario when you do want to double down is when you can actually go for the win. In that case, sure, go for it if you think the chances are on your side. But otherwise, it's oftentimes better to hold on to your threats in your hand. Especially since if you are ahead, the ball is really on your opponent's court to catch up or respond to your threats. You can always see first what they do against your threats and then respond appropriately. Next, you want to consider holding back cards in your hand if you have some form of threat already on the board. Say you have a couple of flying beaters in the air constantly chunking down opponents' health. Similar to when you're ahead, if you have significant threat presence on the board, you can hold on to adding similar threats to the board. In this case, you don't necessarily need to add yet another big flying beater. You'll often want to just wait and see how they deal with the current threats first. If they do play their board wipe, voila! You have another fat flyer in your hand that your opponents will now have to deal with. And the final way to not overcommit here is to hold back cards if your current board state can accumulate value on its own. So if the permanence you have on the board already forms an engine by itself and can generate value at a decent rate, then you do not really need to play more into it. Let the engine you have do its thing, and when it grows into a threat at some point, your opponents will have to deal with it. So instead of investing more to the engine, it's even better if you can protect your engine by holding up that mana. And once they finally spend various resources and dealt with your engine, then you can play more cards, potentially rebuilding your engine. This scenario actually often occurs with my Trostani deck. My engine often has 3 pieces: an efficient token maker, Trostani herself, who duplicate tokens, and often another synergistic card draw piece. Once I have this engine going, I don't really need to add anything else. This engine alone is oftentimes enough to spiral out of control on its own, forcing an opponent to board wipe. So by holding back cards, for example another token maker, I'll be able to immediately re-establish an engine after a board wipe happens. Moving on to tip number 2, diversity of permanent types. While there are board wipes that can get rid of multiple permanent types, farewell, they usually only target specific types, with the big ones being creatures. So, if you diversify your commitment towards the board, there's a good chance something, or hopefully multiple things, will survive after a certain board wipe happens. Enchantments are infamous for being the harder permanent type to remove, so it's always nice to have some of those. And while you do have some control over diversifying your permanents during the game, it also comes to play during deck building. One thing to pay attention is the trade-off between synergy of a single permanent type, let's say creature synergy, versus spreading the risk a bit and having, for example, a few enchantments that provide the same functionality. So the Tokasia's Welcome versus Welcoming Vampire example comes to mind. Another good example is Blood Moon versus Magus of the Moon. Same effect, but Blood Moon is probably more resilient and Magus of the Moon gives you a body. So which does your deck want more? But then of course there's also a case where you just want all of them. Moving on to tip number 3, card draw. So looking back to the first tip about holding back playing cards, there's a way where you can go more gung-ho and play even more cards into an already strong board without that being a big risk. That way is by drawing cards and having a lot of cards in hand. So if you have a full grip even after doubling down to the board, then there's not really much harm in doing so. So it might sound very intuitive, but after a board wipe, there are 2 groups of winners. First group is the players whose permanents survive the board wipe somehow, and the second group is the players who has cards in their hand to immediately rebuild their board with. And finally, another reason card draws are very powerful in this regard is that oppressive card discard effects are both often not that popular and also often a bit frowned upon. Unless, of course, if your pod is filled with Tergrits, Tiny Bones, and Sire of Insanity, that's a different story. Find a new group to play with. I'm just kidding. So, while your stuff on the board will often get wiped, cards in your hand usually is well protected. Wheel effects are probably the exception here, but even then, you get to refill your hand. So, moving on to the final tip, baiting out board wipes. People put board wipes in their decks and your opponent will cast one sooner or later. While most of the time it's not good for us, we can make it work better for us. The key here is when they play it and how it affects us. The board wipe can either destroy all of our most crucial permanents on the board, or it can destroy only some, but not so important stuff of ours. And we can try steer them, our opponents, toward the latter by baiting out their board wipes when the timing is best for us. That is, when we're okay losing stuff on the board. And we can do that by trying to bait out their board wipes. So the idea is simple. Instead of playing your most important cards, play the less impactful ones that you're more okay with losing. If you can make these cards you play have a scary impression, that's even better. And you can even use your sort of meh cards to try pressure whoever you think has a board wipe, say by attacking them. This will incentivize them even further to play their board wipe. And one more thing, though this might only work against less experienced player, the quantity of permanent of your boards often creates an illusion of threat, even if those permanents don't really do much. So this is another way you can bait out board wipes. And finally, once that board wipe hits, boom, you can play all your key cards. Well, if there's a second board wipe coming, that's, well, too bad. So this scenario is not always applicable. It really depends what your hand composition looks like, and one of them is significantly better within that game instance. So those are some of the tips to better survive board wipes in your EDH games. And don't forget to check out my upcoming video that covers specific cards to help you survive board wipes. And if you find this video helpful, please leave a like or consider subscribing. It helps the channel a lot. So with that, Thank you so much for watching. I hope you get to play plenty of exciting EDH games in this new year. I'll see you next time.